All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. And today we continue focusing our attention on artificial intelligence. Those of you who've joined us for previous sessions know that we've already covered the topic of separating AI hype from reality, artificial intelligence and education, and most recently, artificial intelligence and healthcare. Today we turn to AI governance. How do we assure that governments use AI to advance the public interest and increase governmental efficiency without threatening our basic freedoms? And here to talk about this is Michael Karanikolas. He is Executive Director at the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy within the UCLA School of Law. And he's also an affiliated fellow with the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Just prior, he was a Wikimedia Fellow at Yale Law, where he worked on issues related to the complex relationships between law, technology, and society. And in other work, he's participated in several projects connected with freedom of expression, transparency, and digital rights. Some of this work in Canada, but much of it across the globe in such far-flung areas as Afghanistan, Jordan, Indonesia, Myanmar, Uganda, just to name a few. Really quite an international pedigree. Mr. Karanikolas has a law degree from the University of Toronto, and he's the author of many scholarly works dealing with the tension between freedom of expression, technology, and good governance. So please join me in welcoming Michael Karanikolas.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and it's great to be here. Thanks for hosting me and for this invitation. My name is Michael Karanikolas. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, which is a collaboration between the UCLA School of Law and the Samuel Lee School of Engineering. As our inaugural Executive Director, I established our mission to foster research and analysis to ensure new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable. We work on a number of different thematic areas, including policy implications of extended reality and virtual reality, privacy enforcement challenges, diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. And there's a strong focus throughout our work on interdisciplinary engagement. We are an interdisciplinary institute. So within, on the law side of campus, that means bringing law, public policy, and engineering expertise to focus on emerging public policy challenges. On the engineering side of campus, most of our focus is related to developing ethics standards and curricula for computer science and engineering students, although we do some pure computer science work as well related to AI misinformation. The project that I'm going to be talking about today is something that I'm taking forward. It's a year-long project with the Administrative Conference of the United States, which is targeted at developing appropriate standards and safeguards for the use of AI within public sector entities, particularly in regulatory enforcement. So I guess I'm about 3 months into that project. But I should note that here I speak only for myself, and my opinions certainly don't represent the Administrative Conference of the United States, don't represent UCLA, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that I'll note is, that my own background is in law and public policy, and although I teach at the School of Engineering, supervise researchers from the engineering graduate program. I'm the co-PI on research projects exploring machine learning applications with collaborators from the Schools of Engineering and Computer Science. I do not have an engineering or STEM background myself. So if there are questions that tend to stray too far away, I might have to defer. So with all that as background, who can tell me what AI is? Let the record indicate there's no hands up. That's odd. Who here has heard of AI? This isn't a new concept, right? Okay, lots of hands up now. Who here's read a news story about AI? Lots of hands up. Okay, who can tell me what AI is? Still nobody? Gosh. Well, so it turns out, despite all the hype and despite all the news stories, defining AI is actually pretty tricky. And partly that's due to the technical nature of this sort of basket of technologies. Partly that's due to this delta that exists between how these technologies, how artificial intelligence is popularly understood and how it's understood by the folks that are actually building these machines. But it actually is a technically challenging thing to define. And even within individual bodies, sometimes, definitions can be inconsistent. Congress included one definition of AI in the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019, and a different definition in the National AI Initiative Act of 2020. So there's a lot of variation. And just as a framing exercise, quite often definitions of artificial intelligence are grounded in comparisons with human intelligence. It's not optimal to do it this way, but this is something that we very frequently see. Technology that otherwise requires human intelligence, technology that is inspired by the human mind, right? Technology which ordinarily requires biological brain power to accomplish, right? It's not super specific, but this is what a lot of legislation is deferring to. Here in Texas, technology which imitates intelligent behavior, right? This definition from Rhode Island defaults to an inclusive definition. We don't know what AI is, but it includes computerized methods of tools that act in a way that resemble human cognitive abilities. Other definitions, legislative definitions, are extraordinarily broad, right? This one from Louisiana, artificial intelligence combines computer science and robust data sets to enable problem-solving measures directly to consumers. I believe what they've described is the entire field of computer science, or at least the application-based aspect of that field. So again, it's a tricky thing that even experts are grappling with. Self-learning is typically the other feature that we see commonly across definitions of AI. Machines that are capable of improving through experience, learning from data or learning by doing. The EU AI Act presents a definition which is similar to the definition floated by the OECD, which has become very internationally influential, and that grounds its definition in the system's decision-making and predictive abilities. We see a similar definition from the National Artificial Intelligence Act. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2019 defines AI through capacity to act without human oversight. And likewise, a number of there's even definitions that define AI through the ability to act rationally, right? That's an interesting one. And there's even some technical standards bodies which are a little bit cagey. Of course, closer to home, here's a definition from the California Department of Technology that mimics cognitive functions that as humans associate with human minds. And just to wrap it up, the last publication that I put out on AI, here's how we defined it, or how we described it. Now, the point of all of this is not to get bogged down in definitions. I understand definitions are boring, but when you're trying to craft effective policy, this stuff matters. And the fact that the Venn diagram of all of these different technologies that have been described in all these different legislative formulas is going to be all over the place, that creates a problem in establishing an effective legislative framework, especially when different governments, different levels of government are all talking about different things. And it's particularly problematic if we want to track how AI is being rolled out across different levels of government. And I say being rolled out because these use cases are not hypothetical. Now, as part of this project that I'm doing at the moment, I'm just starting a survey of different government agencies to talk about how they've implemented different AI systems. Because I'm only just starting that survey, this list relies on use cases that were identified in a previous survey by David Freeman Engstrom, Daniel Ho, Catherine Sharkey, and Mariano Florentino Queller. That was published in early 2020. So this research is probably at least 4 to 5 years old, and it's a safe bet that things have advanced a lot since then. But let's go through some of these. Some of the use cases that were identified by the previous authors included from the Securities and Exchange Commission, using AI-powered tools in order to triage enforcement priorities by spotting suspicious trading patterns to try to track potential insider trading. Customs and Border Patrol, facial recognition has been all over the place for a number of years at ports of entry. Likewise for risk scoring of travelers. Social Security Administration. They've been extremely cagey. Well, all government entities have been extremely cautious, as far as I've been able to see so far, about AI making decisions on questions related to, for example, applications for benefits, but they have been using it for a number of years to support the drafting of decisions, which is a laborious process. Patent and Trademark Office, right? The Patent and Trademark Office has been using AI tools for years as part of their research support. Assessing patent and trademark applications, again, takes a huge amount of work, huge amount of research to figure out if something is duplicative or if it infringes on existing patents and trademarks when a new application gets filed. So this is enormously helpful if a application for a new kind of mousetrap comes in and you can have technology which searches all the other mousetraps that have been filed and see if this is a better one. FDA. Post-market surveillance. This is particularly important today as an increasing number of medical devices are themselves AI-enabled. So what do I mean by that? You have an increasing number of, say, diagnostic tools that are powered by AI. Now, that's great, and it's a great way to boost capacity for technicians that are reviewing x-rays or whatever it is. But the problem is, these tools, the purpose of them is that they learn and continue to improve. So if you have a tool that's been approved with a given performance standard, and then it gets plugged into a hospital, and the hospital is using it, that tool is going to be changing every day, constantly changing as new data comes in. And there's a possibility that what's approved, once it gets released into the wild, is going to drift in problematic directions and create problematic outcomes. So as a result of AI being used in medical devices, there's a huge need for post-market surveillance to ensure that it's not drifting away from its original efficacy. And AI can itself be useful in facilitating that surveillance. Likewise, the FCC and the CFPB have been using AI to interface with the public, as well as to process comments and complaints, potentially to check if they've been automatically authored. Again, you have this arms race where the public can use language models to generate comments, and large volumes of comments as part of government consultation processes, and governments responding by developing their own AI to sort of sift through these. None of these use cases involves a fully autonomous AI decision maker. But these automated systems can nonetheless be enormously influential in government decision-making or regulatory enforcement processes. And there's enormous capacity for novel kinds of problems to arise. To give an example, remember that one that I said off the top? with the SEC using AI-powered tools to identify suspicious trading activity? Well, it's easy to imagine the contractor that designed those tools turning around and going to a major investment bank and saying, how would you like to never get audited? I know exactly what the SEC is looking for. I can design you a tool to make sure that your trades never raise a red flag. And that's, can be an issue with third-party contractors, can be an issue even if you have an internal staffer developing that. That person leaves, goes to the private sector. Likewise, Customs and Border Protection, the challenges around AI bias are probably easy to spot. If you have a data set on risk scoring that incorporates a lot of data from, say 2001 to 2008, can anybody guess if there were particular kinds of travelers that were being subjected to very heightened scrutiny during that time period? What kind of outcomes is it going to spit out on who you are, on who CBP should be targeting? Even in the Patent and Trademark Office, right? The utility of these research tools in assessing patent applications it's enormously useful. But there are, for patent applications, there can be huge sums of money at stake. So again, if you think about a contractor who designs these tools or who knows these tools and can then go to the private sector, go to a drug company and say, this examiner over here has a 30% approval rate for this kind of drug. This examiner over here has a 45% approval rate for this kind of drug. I know how the AI classification system works, and I can help you design your application to make sure that it gets to an examiner that has a higher approval rate. That tiny little, that small percentage increase, if you're talking about a drug worth hundreds of millions of dollars, is worth a lot of money in the right hands. And so there's an enormous potential for problematic behavior, for abuse of the system, for gaming the system, and this is before we get into challenges around accuracy and privacy and bias and drift. And what makes all this even more concerning is that there's really a lack of coordination and tracking of these tools. I mean, we talked about all these different definitions. We have guesses and survey data based on conversations with people at government agencies about how these things are being rolled out. Nobody's really comprehensively tracking this across the federal government, across the state government, across really any government that I'm aware of around the world. There's an enormous absence of data about where these technologies are being rolled out, and it creates a problem with developing effective safeguards. And the other thing that I'll mention before we move on is it's very important to understand that even if we're not talking about an AI system that is making decisions, right? These systems still can be enormously influential in the decision-making process. So, you can think about a spectrum of decision-making influence, right? I think that lots of folks are uncomfortable with the idea that you go before the government, whether it's a benefits application or whether it's a trademark claim or whatever you want from the government. The idea that an AI is making that decision makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. But some of that might evaporate if you're talking about a system which is, it's not making the decision itself, but it's only providing a recommendation for the human decision maker, and the human's the one who's actually making the decision. There's a lot of systems like that out there. Can anybody guess how often the humans tend to follow the AI recommendations? Pretty much all the time, right? Is it a meaningful difference? No, but substantively, people feel more comfortable with one than the other. Likewise, you can get more and more abstract and imagine an automated system which is not even making a suggestion. All it's doing is presenting the human decision maker with a set of factors they should consider in making their decision. Well, that's a little bit less dangerous, but still enormously influential over the process. And then you can get even more abstract than that and talk about AI as a pure research tool and saying, well, we're not even going to give you recommendations for the kind of factors to consider. All we're going to do is to present a package of research so you don't have to spend hours digging through dusty filing cabinets to find this stuff yourself. Again, enormously useful, but still enormously influential. And in every one of these cases, AI is impacting the ultimate decision to varying degrees. So what are the safeguards that we have? So in California, there's some of the ones that we've identified in early research as the high-risk automated decision-making systems inventory, which designates a report on high-risk automated decision-making systems that are used, procured, or developed by state government agencies by the beginning of 2025. This slide, for some reason, doesn't mention Executive Order 1223, which was enacted in December, I think, and has a bunch of relevant guidelines around procurement, impact assessments, developing innovation in the public sector. I'll note that there are a whole lot of legislative proposals in this space. Obviously, lots of them are left out of this slide, so if we have folks from the legislature here that are unhappy that I've left out something you're working with, apologies. One of the bills that I didn't leave out here, that didn't make it onto this as well, which I just read this morning, AB 2885, which states the intent of the legislature to define AI, which I was quite interested to see. There's significant variation in the scope and scale of all these different regulatory proposals. My personal belief is that the breadth of these technologies and inconsistencies in how they are defined and used suggests that rather than trying to find one piece of legislation that's going to be your one-stop shop for everything related to AI, legislative and regulatory frameworks are typically more effective when they're more targeted and application-specific, in order to ensure that they adopt a posture which fits the potential use case and to allow for iteration as these technologies continue to move forward. I think it's better to take a bite out of the problem than to seek a one-shot solution, although I also recognize that it's not as exciting or splashy to have a kind of narrow target thing as opposed to something like the EU AI Act, which is meant to cover everything. So that's potentially a challenge. The most ambitious of these frameworks is probably the California AI Accountability Act, which is a heavily risk-based framework and tasks the Government Operations Agency, the Department of Technology, and the Office of Data and Innovation with developing risk assessments. Another challenge with anything that centralizes that responsibility is that risk assessments and individual use cases are incredibly contextual. So you need an intimate level of familiarity with how these technologies are actually going to be rolled out and the culture that's going to inform the use of these technologies and the individuals that are going to be using these technologies to fully understand their risk case. A number of these legislative proposals feature transparency, which is great. The AI Accountability Act does, the AI Aware Act does. Transparency and coordination is a necessary first step to effective AI governance. In order to have a proper framework around this stuff, we have to understand how it's being used. So I certainly think that's a gatekeeping problem, though obviously not sufficient in and of itself. Several of these legislative proposals also feature new research initiatives like the Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier AI Systems Act and the California AI Research Hub. Both of these give a nod to research into the harms and biases and pitfalls related to AI. Neither is as explicitly interdisciplinary as I would have liked, and again, maybe that's my bias coming from an interdisciplinary research institute, but I believe that you develop the most effective solutions when you include engineering and computer science students alongside law and public policy people and get them in a room together to talk about this stuff. At the federal level, there's a huge amount of interest in this space, but mostly on the scoping side. That leads me to be curious as to whether we're going to see a repeat of the privacy situation over the next few years, where, as folks who are tracking privacy legislation may or may not know, will probably know, one of the big obstacles to establishing a federal privacy law has revolved around reluctance to anything that would preempt state-level privacy legislation. So as California and Illinois and other states are moving forward, I think that's going to leave interesting questions around preemption related to AI safety. But probably the most ambitious and practically useful framework that's been put out at the federal level is NIST's AI risk management framework. The AI risk management framework contains an outstanding mapping of all of the different issues and risks. The taxonomy of risks, I think, is enormously helpful for folks that are trying to design an effective framework. It also presents a model of effective governance throughout the life cycle of an AI product, including go or no-go decision points. And I think that that's so fundamentally important, is that you really need to constantly reassess if the game is worth the candle. Are these things actually working as intended? Is this an area that is appropriate for automated decision-making or for AI generally? And it's important to have a system in place where you're not so invested and have so much sunk costs into one of these systems that you don't allow it to fail if failure is the correct option. So I think that having decision points that include the options of just walking away from the use of this particular technology for this particular application is fundamental. The AI RMF is somewhat vague and open-ended by design. As I alluded to earlier, context is fundamental in developing an appropriate regulatory mechanism for these systems. So NIST envisions an ecosystem of collective responsibility across implementing agencies, or I should say within implementing agencies. NIST obviously can't do that work, can't centralize that work because they're not familiar with the use case. And this creates a parallel challenge. This parallels the challenge with third-party developers. If you have a regulatory framework that seeks to outsource all of this onto the third-party contractors that are developing these systems, there's a stovepiping challenge where they may not fully understand how the technology is going to be used or the institutional culture that it's going to come up against, which will lead to their erroneous assessment of what the potential harms are. Right, that's NIST's taxonomy. I'll talk briefly about the international context before providing a few takeaways, and then we'll move over to Q&A. So internationally, most of you who follow this space will probably have heard of the European Union's AI Act. That's certainly been the sort of biggest and splashiest move to regulate this space. It leans heavily on risk assessments by companies, it also includes a few great big asterisks for government uses of these technologies and national security uses of these technologies. I think that's a problem, but government frameworks very often tend to take a very hard and careful look at the private sector and then sort of hand wave away government uses of these technologies. There's a similar thing with the Singapore's Model AI Governance Framework, and more recently the development of AI Verify, which is a testing framework toolkit designed to support independent self-assessment. Again, private sector actors is what they're focused on, much less than governments. Canada's Directive on Automated Decision-Making is focused on government. It was also, I think, relatively early as a move into this space. However, even Canada's framework has a very glaring exception for national security systems, which are very vaguely defined, as well as several other agencies within Canada that are just expressly excluded from requirements. And China's regulatory landscape is another place where some interesting things are happening. Possibly not surprisingly, their regulation draws very heavily from cybersecurity structures, which amalgamate conceptions of data security with a broader focus on national security, not necessarily pointing to that as a model, but there are interesting things happening. One thing that I'll note about pretty much all the governments on this list, or all the structures on this list, is conversations around AI regulation are dominated by rich world governments and interests. And as a result, impacts of these technologies that are disproportionately focused on the global poor are often ignored. And that includes labor impacts, that includes the enormous environmental impacts around the development and use of these technologies, as well as concerns related to global supply chains and inequality questions related to their potential impact on development. even the GPAI, which is ostensibly a multi-stakeholder framework, it includes Brazil, India, Senegal, and Argentina. However, they were able to join based on their signing on to what was essentially an OECD draft of standards in this space. And as a result, there are global majority or global south governments that are involved, but playing according to rules that have been set by the rich world. Likewise, you have other processes like UNESCO's, which have made a greater impact, greater effort to be inclusive of majority world governments. But this presents its own challenge as the interests that are being represented by those governments do not necessarily represent the interests of the citizens within their countries that are at the sharpest edge of technological change. So where does all that leave us? Well, I'm going to leave us with a few kind of points of that sort of crystallize my own thinking about regulation in this space, and then I'd be delighted to open it up for Q&A. To start, the attention to private sector companies that are experimenting with this space is welcome and necessary. But whatever we expect of the private sector, our expectations on governments and the public sector should be significantly higher. When it comes to transparency rules, when it comes to ethics and social responsibility rules, the impact of public sector uses of these technologies on things like fundamental freedoms and human rights are far more profound. So that's one. Individual risk assessments is a common area of focus among legislative frameworks, but while these assessments should not be ignored, there's a danger that they'll miss the forest for the trees. Individual applications may indeed present individual risks, but there's a broader risk related to the impact of automated decision-making and AI systems more generally on perceptions of fairness and legitimacy in the public sector. I very much welcome initiatives towards transparency and disclosure of where these systems are being used. I think that's important. I also don't think that it's sufficient. The last thing we need is additional, boxes to click through every time we go to a website. I think that that's a starting point, is to get a sense of where these technologies are being have been rolled out, and where they're being employed. But obviously, that's only the first step to providing effective governance. Coordination and pooling resources across the public sector is a promising avenue forward, as is collaboration with academic and civil society organizations who are active in this space. Again, maybe that's self-interested as somebody who runs an academic institute that's active in this space. The breadth of these technologies and inconsistencies in how they are defined suggests that an application-based approach to legislation and regulation is preferable to something more general. I also welcome the notion of iteration in standards development. Speakers have pointed out that the EU's AI Act, there was a rush at the very last minute to amend the legislation. One of the reasons why the final process was so fraught was because there was a need to amend the legislation at the very last minute to incorporate changes in these technologies that have happened over the course of the development of the legislation. That's always going to be the case if you have one giant flagship law that you're pinning all your hopes on. Iteration is a better way to go, particularly given how rapidly these technologies are advancing. And it's also important to understand trade-offs inherent in the values that governments might pursue. It's great to say, like, we want interpretability, we want explainability, we want privacy, we want accuracy, but there are trade-offs across these different tools. Interpretability can lead to challenges related to privacy. Predictive accuracy can lead to challenges related to interpretability. And privacy can lead to challenges related to accuracy, which itself can impact fairness. So rather than saying this is a shopping list of what we want our AI to, of what we want these tools to reflect, it's important to think about the trade-offs inherent in nudging developers in particular directions. Finally, there has been significant emphasis on traditional due process protections, particularly related to transparency, reviewability, separation of functions, provision of reasons, etc. Essentially, a lot of the conversations around the use of around AI decision makers or the use of AI within regulatory enforcement or decision-making processes has focused on porting the standards that we apply to human decision makers over to these automated systems. Here's what we expect a human to do. Let's get the machine to do something, to do the same thing. And I think that that's actually wrong. I think that the question should be, what are the fundamental values underlying these qualities that we look for in human decision makers? And whether or not automated processes are capable of fulfilling those same values, and if so, how can we craft a parallel framework that suits the way that these models function? And can a parallel framework be developed? Our system of administrative law and our rules around due process evolved as a check against very particular flaws in human decision making. And more precisely, they were developed in support of these goals that we envision to be essential for a robust system of accountable governance. One example of that is that the law requires human decision makers to explain their rulings, right? Now, this is important in order to establish appropriate grounds for reviewing decisions, but it's also important to protect the dignity of the subjects of those decisions and support legitimacy and stakeholder buy-in to the decision-making process. If you get a decision from a government and it's just a yes or a no with nothing behind it, as a subject, it makes the person feel as if they are an object of an exercise of power, nothing else. Whereas in addition to reviewability and explainability and ensuring robust engagement with the process, these reasons and explanations make the subject, give them a sense of personal dignity, are important to providing a sense of personal dignity in the process to show that they are not an objective of arbitrariness. So the question is not, can we design an AI system that can provide those reasons? The question is, can we design an AI system which is capable of delivering those same underlying goals, including perceptions of dignity and fundamental fairness, right? So rather than seeking to port expectations from humans to AI, I think there's a deeper question to ask about whether it's possible to establish procedural rules which achieve those same outcomes in an AI context. So thanks again for this opportunity to present. I very much look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for a great talk today.